On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Adam Robertson. He is the head of DevOps at Pinger. We're going to be tackling a couple different topics over the course of this episode. We're going to be talking about the challenges of implementing DevOps principles and practices, small versus large companies, and some of the inertia for and against. We're going to be talking about that building of a DevOps practice and the psychology behind how it affects the team, especially if you're retooling and you need new potential skills or new individuals to join. And we're going to touch on how far left DevOps should be moving. I know Adam's a practitioner himself, and I'm super happy that he's agreed to be on the podcast. Thank you, Adam.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Absolutely. So I did not obviously do justice to your background. I always like to start off with the guests kind of sending some context of who they are and kind of what they're doing, and we'll jump in there.
So I've been doing DevOps for over a decade. Started in the late 2000s when the DevOps revolution started kicking off here in Silicon Valley. Been doing exclusively DevOps for that since. Typically going into either smaller, newer startups and launching the DevOps program from start. And most recently in Pinger, going into a 12-year-old company with established practices and infrastructure, and kind of starting the DevOps revolution, or evolution, I should say, for them over the last 2 years.
Awesome. As you've seen the shift, the maturation of DevOps practices, what are some of the challenges you've seen different orgs when they're first approaching, hey, we need to adopt a more DevOps-centric view of our engineering team?
Sure. And it's different for different size companies, right? Like if you get into a younger startup and the idea of having an operations guy who knows how to code, right? That's kind of how it started. Is you get these jack of all trades that understands, the software development lifecycle. They understand release and build and release practices along with QA, and they're familiar with the infrastructure used to run it. So they're ops people as well, right? That's kind of how it started. The adoption there tends to be a lot easier. Things are more agile. Things aren't built yet. That's one key component. And you come in and you're able to face the slew of problems that present themselves, and you're immediately able to be solution oriented because a lot of things you're building from scratch. There's not a lot of invested practitioners that were there before you building something that you're asking to replace. And that's, I think, a key fundamental difference between, say, a smaller size company that's newer versus an older, larger company with well-established either practices or infrastructure or just general culture. And you have to approach those things very differently. And that's something that I've learned in my time. So the company saying, come on in, we want you to build everything from scratch because we have no infrastructure. That's an easy one, right? Because you come in, you're able to propose plans. You don't have to take an existing large infrastructure and do a migration. You're building a greenfield. And that's a different game versus coming into a larger infrastructure with established practices and cultures to where you have to play a whole different game. And this is more of a psychology game. And the way you go about that is extremely sensitive. And now you're dealing with emotions and psyche and egos, especially. So it changes the game quite a bit. And that's something that I've definitely learned at Pinger in the 2 years there is, the way you approach it and the way you handle it is of the utmost importance. And it's very much a careful game that you have to play when dealing with people that you have to convince to make change.
It obviously makes a lot of sense. If there's nothing there, you walk in, you can lay the foundation as best you can with what's available, maybe some forward thinking. I guess just to touch on, since you've been at some bigger companies as well, like when you look back at it and you go into an environment where you're trying to have a shift in the direction of infrastructure and potential, what you're asking the team to deliver, in terms of getting buy-in, obviously somebody at the top is going, hey, this is fantastic, VP of engineering, CTO. When you're looking at actually then incorporating your, the team there, what's typically been the view that you've gotten or kind of the reaction? Is it like, oh, this is amazing? Or is it like, oh, okay, well, what about me? What's the typical reaction?
That's a great question because it's not something I initially considered in the beginning. And that was one of the mistakes that I had made was, when you're used to coming into an environment where people say, nothing's built yet, we trust you, so go ahead and go. You go in and you come in like a wrecking ball. And that's the absolute wrong approach when you have an established company. So what I quickly learned is you're not coming in telling everyone your plan, what you are going to do. That is not the right approach, right? The approach that I found that works the best is a very sit back and listen approach, learn, because every piece of infrastructure that is there, every tool, every piece of development software, anything that they've chosen up until that point was chosen by a person for a reason, right? You're not working with people who just arbitrarily decided to buy, Circle CI instead of Jenkins or something. These are made for a reason. And you have to understand that reason. And you have to kind of wrap your head around the problem that they were trying to solve in the beginning and why they chose a solution that they did. And, a lot of times time has lapsed by. So that could be a friend, right? You can say to yourself, well, I understand completely why you made the decisions you made at the time. Perl was actually the predominant language 10 years ago. So, or PHP, and I understand why you made half your scripts in, PHP 5. Now, there's other scripting languages which are more advanced and it might be a better choice to go this way. I think if you try to tell people that what they built was not good or not good enough or in some way was flawed, you're going to have people raising boundaries and walls against you so quick. You're going to be doing yourself a huge disservice because what you've done then is you've created a rift in the relationship, right? You've essentially insulted them or what they've built. So if you don't take the time to kind of initially come in and take the approach of, I'm here to learn, I'm here to identify problems, understand the solutions that are in place, and provide options for better ones or for alternatives, right? So once you start to get the idea to the solution phase, right, you really want to establish a good relationship with the people that understand where you're coming from as a positive place, right? You're not looking to replace what they've done per se for the sake of replacing it. You want to come at it in the terms of saying, hey, the problem itself has changed. There's a new component, like we've modified ourselves as a company, we've shifted, we've done whatever, or there's a new set of technologies that are available. Like, let's relook at this problem and look at potential solutions here. And not only that, I'm not here to tell them, I'm here to tell you in my experience what I've done in the past, but let's work this together. Let's look at the problem, look at the potential set of solutions and come together, figure out what's important for us and work together in a solution. And that does a lot of things. One, it makes people feel involved, right? They are part of the solution, which is one of the biggest things. They're not being replaced. There's not this new guy coming in, thinks he knows it all and is going to bring the new technology that they don't understand. That's not the way that you want them to be thinking about it. You want them to think of you as an ally and part of the team, and you're creating new solutions alongside them so they can take ownership of this and they can have a say. I've come in and had complete solutions, and I have the person that has actually built the last one present the new solution, right? It's their idea, they're part of it, and they can take ownership. And there's no ego on my side. That's fine. And they feel great. They're happy with this. They want to do this. They're on your team, right? And that takes time. That takes a lot of relationship building and a lot of careful way of how you approach things, right? And you're not walking on eggshells per se, but you're understanding individual people's motivations. How you have to approach them is going to be different than you have to approach someone else. If you get younger guys that have no stake in the game, they're pretty easy, right? You're like, hey, you want to play with Kubernetes? They're like, yes, I do.
Easy sell.
Yeah, exactly. But the 55-year-old ops guy who single-handedly built the network for the data center, that's going to be a harder sell. Convincing him that cloud infrastructure is different or better in some way, that is not something you're going to do overnight. And that's something you have to understand. Like earlier, I said revolution versus evolution, and absolutely is an evolution. Revolutions are quick, dirty, and somewhat bloody sometimes. Evolutions are, they are fluid and reactive, right? As new things happen, you adjust and you have to be agile and these kind of things. So if you think about it more as a longer term evolution of change, that's a better way to approach it.
You mentioned, obviously, you're working hand in hand to understand decisions. And we're talking about, obviously, when there might be a shift. And it just occurred to me, a good question to piggyback off of that is so let's say you've already shifted, right? And time's passed since you last put a solution in place. How often are you looking at, let's say, the decision behind a scripting language or piece of technology? How frequently does that happen? Because obviously you can't keep jumping tracks. Nothing will ever get done. People are constantly rebuilding, retooling. But how often does that type of thing happen where you're like, okay, we're going to take advantage of XYZ that's happening?
That's a very good thing to ask because not a lot of people consider that. And that's something that I've systematically built into most project plans. So not only are you like an agent of change while trying to convince people to make change, but you a lot of the times are the ones driving it, right? You're suggesting new technologies that maybe not everyone understands. And so you have to make sure best practices for those particular set of technologies are observed. You want to make sure they're deployed right. So if you're not, a project leader, you're definitely a major stakeholder. One thing that I have done is in all the new technologies I've introduced, I have checkpoints that are 3 months, 6 months in. And I actually say, this is just a straight architecture review. That's just what I call it, right? A standard architecture review of, hey, is this technology actually solving the problem we wanted to solve? If not, maybe it's time, we've invested X amount of time, but let's make sure we're on the right course. Let's make sure we haven't pivoted from the original problem we were trying to solve. And that is not a solitary thing, right? That's all the stakeholders coming in, revisiting the original project plan about the problem you're trying to solve, why you chose the technology you did, and being open to saying, hey, does anyone have a problem with what we've done thus far? Are we forcing this? Are we pounding a square peg into a round hole? Is this not the right thing? Sometimes you choose technologies which just aren't right. Like Kubernetes may just be too big for what you're trying to do. And something simple like, just simple containers running on Docker might be your best bet. And so it's good to plan those kind of architectural reviews into any project you do and make it public, make it be known that you are open to being told that, you know what, we didn't choose the right thing. And that's okay because we took a time to review it. We're going to go ahead and go back to the drawing board. We haven't invested that much time and we can make changes and have everyone that's in those conversations be absolutely comfortable saying those words, saying, you know what, I think we chose wrong. And that's okay. And that adds to the general culture of being adaptive to change, right? We generally talk about a lot of these practices and principles of DevOps, but also you're an agent of change with culture. The idea that you are able to make these technology changes easily because you build these platforms. You build these cloud native platforms that are elastic, you use containers, so you don't have to choose a language. You can switch it on the fly, right? You make a very adaptive platforms and infrastructure to where you can make change easily. And you bring about a culture of change is not scary. That's a big one because a lot of people I've been using CentOS 7 for 15 since it was released, CentOS for 15 years. I am not okay with running Debian. And I can say, okay, you don't have to be because, we're running containers. So the people that want to run Go on Debian can do that. You can run PHP 7.2 on CentOS and that's fine. We don't have to pick or choose, right? You just provide adaptable solutions. You make people comfortable with the idea of change.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to come back to the culture of change in a second, but when it comes to decisions, so obviously within the process, you're going to set up checkpoints to evaluate. When does the pain of shifting possibly outweigh the benefit? Like at some point, it's just like, oh God, like we can do it. We'll take advantage of it. And the ROI might be there, but it's just expensive and the ROI might be a longer payoff. And can the organization digest something like that?
Yeah, and there's always two sides to any change, the technical justification and the monetary. They're two different audiences. And, when you are acting as an agent of change in this capacity, you have to be borderline schizophrenic, right? You have to be able to approach the technical stakeholders with the technical advantages of making a change. And then I would approach engineers about saying, listen, this is something to where it gives you freedom of X, Y, and Z. You can be free to make the choices that you wish because it's containerized. Then I'll actually go up to the engineering manager and say, listen, your build time is going to be reduced down by 30%. So your engineers are actually going to have more time and less context switching. And then I go up to the CFO and I say, actually, our cloud infrastructure here is going to run at 10% cost of what our data center monthly cost is for power. So you're basically presenting the solutions in three different ways to three different stakeholders because that's what they care about. And so you're always going to run into some pushback, right? And that's something you're going to have to deal with. At the end of the day, there may be some decisions where you say, I want to make this switch. And someone says to you, this is too radical. Either we're not ready for it yet, or it's too expensive, so we can't do it. One classic example is, hey, I want to move to the cloud. The CFO turns and looks at you and says, I've got $4 million worth of servers sitting in San Jose. No, we're not moving to the cloud. And that's a hard one to come up against, right? Because what do you say to that? Yeah, you made this decision, before I even got there. We do have that hardware. We can't just throw it away. So then you start to shift, right? Then you're like, okay, well, we can achieve some of these objectives that we want by using our hardware and converting it into a hybrid cloud, right? Then all of a sudden we're utilizing the hardware we already own. We're having cloud native architectures be built, all these adaptive elastic platforms being available to the engineers, but we're doing it in our data center. So that satisfies our CFO. And then we also get the benefits that we spoke of to the engineers and the engineering managers, right? So you have to be adaptive when it comes to that. I've never actually been told straight up, no. It's more saying, it's the more polite way of saying it's difficult, maybe too difficult. And that's something you can work with.
Yeah, obviously the art of satisfying the technology need and then the business requirement. And then depending upon the business you're in, you're right. If you're at a software company, there's different needs and drivers of why you need the latest and greatest. If you're an insurance company, you might carry the data center. Like you might be like the justification for the benefits, near term. Obviously, you might be pushing out some of what could be looming problems because obviously you're not staying current with other parameters that are also going to impact, security, DevOps, engineering, but financial decisions sometimes, depending on the org, overrule all.
And living in the time we do, compliance, right?
Yeah.
We're in California, we have CCPA, and I've worked in healthcare, right? So we have HIPAA. Then also, if you're in the cloud, you got to deal with SOC compliance, and if you deal with monetary payments, you have to deal with that. And God forbid you want to put a data center in Europe, you're now GDPRs. So you have to operate within the constraints of that. And again, those are more hard constraints, right? Some things are very simple, like we want to launch this service in Europe. That's fine. That means we have to build a cloud presence there and data can't leave, right? That's one of the hard requirements. It's hard to work around. But you can architect your infrastructure and your application solutions to where that works, right? You can be adaptive and work around these kind of hard requirements. If you came back to the CFO, for instance, and you said, I know we've got all that hardware there, but I just don't care. I want to move to the cloud. You're just going to get a no. You have to recognize when you can play ball and what you can fudge and what you can't. Obviously, compliance, you can't. That's just a simple one. Most of the other stuff, if you're adaptive and you're clever, you can finally, find solutions that appeal to everybody and kind of work your way through. And that's part of the fun of doing what we do, I think, is you get to be creative and you find really fun solutions for really hard problems. So
on a side note, I was talking to a CISO and he said, security people were always the last team to be invited to Christmas parties. And that changed when compliance came into place. Now they're the last one invited to Christmas parties, which I found was pretty funny because obviously, like some of these initiatives are very complex and they add complexity. DevOps itself, I mean, it's been shifting, right? So initially, there were some basic pieces that every system admin turning DevOps engineer was picking up and was applying and was working. For the last couple of years, we've been observing that there's a distinct shift to the left, like heading towards engineering. So I was just kind of curious from your point of view in terms of what you've been seeing in terms of that evolution and kind of the impact to the teams that you've been working with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the benefits of shifting left, I think, are universally acknowledged. And that's something that I've heard from almost every single VP of engineering is maintaining that construct, right? Like, how can we, detect problems earlier, right? Have better testing earlier, unit tests that are run really quickly, get them as far left as possible so we can detect problems faster, right? Because if you have a branch getting all the way near the end to release and you find a problem, you got to go back way far, right? The benefits are obvious there. I think part of the DevOps is having a good, solid understanding of the software development lifecycle and also the problems that are faced with engineers. That's why, DevOps is pretty clearly development and operations, right? You have to understand all angles and not just the operations teams and engineers, but also the release managers and the QA teams. And it's a complete picture. When I look at the problems that I'm solving, I look at a 10,000 view of everything that happens from the time a ticket is created. Product has it, in PRD, and then all of a sudden tickets are being created. That's when your job starts, right? How can you create testing platforms that shift left and have, thorough testing, functional testing in the beginning? How can you create the process to where engineers have production-like environments to work with, right? There's nothing worse than hearing, okay, it worked on my machine. And like, okay, granted, it worked on your machine, but you're running a Windows machine using a different version of PHP than some prod. Of course, that's going to work for you and not going to work on a Linux machine. So you want to provide all the engineers and the QA teams with, production-like environments. You have to have the mindset of understanding the problems of everybody all the way from left to right, not just the engineers, but the QA team and the build and release people and the operations who are operating on it and the customer service who are the ones who are actually reporting problems that weren't detected in testing. How do you get that feedback loop back into engineering so we can, automatically either create tickets or automatically measure like new features, right? This is an important part of the DevOps infinity loop is actually looping back all the feedback from everything to the right of deployment back into the left side so they can feed off that. So you can have data-driven decisions about either what works, what doesn't, what's being used. I mean, the most famous example is you spend 100 engineering hours on this new feature. Everyone loves it. You release it. There's no errors. You're like, wow, that was awesome. And then you go back and look and you're like, we've got 7 people using that. That's not a success story. You didn't take into the fact that what happens after you release that software and feed that back into the engineering team for feedback. So it's a complete picture that you have to understand of the life of any kind of feature or any kind of software. Is it starts way far left and it doesn't end right. It feeds back in. So DevOps is one of the unique ones where you have to have both a 10,000 foot view of what's happening with all those teams, but also a micro view of the individual tools in the tool chain and what happens along each process And one of the struggles that you might have is saying, okay, here's our North Star. Here's what we want to get: full CI/CD. Anyone merges to develop, it actually goes through a series of tests. It's released in the wild. We actually are able to do canary testing at 10% per hour over the next 10 hours. And we're able to have automatic rollbacks. And this is just amazing. The problem is it's extraordinarily difficult to achieve that because you've got to involve 4 different teams. That's just for one product. What if you have 10 different products you're having to do this? And now have unique constraints. We've got mobile, which requires iOS machines that you can only build on a Mac, right? And so that has a different constraint versus being able to build in the cloud where you can actually run on Kubernetes because you're just building PHP, right? So all of a sudden it becomes far more complicated. So yeah, I would encourage anyone to try to look first at the 10,000 foot view of what problems you're trying to solve and also identify along the way and include things like what are the engineers' problems? And when it leaves there and it goes to QA, what are their problems? And then to ops and then to customer service. And this makes a complete picture of what you have to understand as DevOps to make, good positive change. And that's why a lot of the times we speak in terms of principles and practices because actual directions on how to do this don't work. Every company is different. Every team is different. Every product is different. So when you speak about these things, you speak about principles that you should observe and try to promote as a culture. And that is really what helps drive this kind of change.
And I guess, what's interesting is you're shifting left, but you have to obviously not only have a high level view, but keep your eye right. I guess I've spoken to a few people and they're talking about how DevOps principles, potentially there shouldn't be a DevOps engineering role, right? Software engineers are able to pick up these principles. It should never have been a role. They should absorb those responsibilities. I mean, right now, organizations aren't still fully executing, DevOps to anyone's liking for the most part. Do you think that's even possible to shift that far left that software engineering basically adopts the principles and it kind of starts eliminating some of the actual DevOps engineering titles? What do you think?
I think anything is possible. I would say that. And I've run into that. I've heard just straight up, well, DevOps doesn't own anything. Like you promote the culture. And that goes far. And at the end of the day, a lot of times you're undergoing a digital transformation, which requires the advent of new technologies. And for me to go up to an engineering team and say, here's the advantages of going to more cloud native elastic infrastructure, something like Kubernetes, and like, here's how you can design these applications and the introduction of service meshes that, obfuscate things like database connections and all the fun stuff. And then they say, yeah, that's great. And then you turn around and say, well, good luck. For me, you're not going far enough, right? You've just shown them the world and then you just tell them how to figure it out on their own. If you're going to be evangelizing these technologies and these practices and this general culture of having, fully automated CI/CD pipelines, right? You not only have to tell them about it, you have to show them. One of the first things I did a month after I joined Pinger is actually, I built basically a fully CI/CD pipeline for one of the products and actually released it out to just, a fake site. And so I showed it to them and actually I made one quick change in code and I committed it. And then I went on to talk and 2 minutes later it was live. And they were like, wait, did you just deploy it? I'm like, yeah. Like, well, they were just so confused. And they were like, wait a minute. And they had all these questions. You could see the excitement in their eyes. And they're like, we definitely want that. And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, let me show you how. So you can't just, in my opinion, this may be different for other people that have done this. And you can't just evangelize the greatness of what life will be like when you've adopted these principles. You're there as the agent of change and you're the guiding light. You're the one showing how to do it. You can't just tell people start using Kubernetes. That's just not how it works. The engineers would say, oh, how? That's the first question. And you're presenting a barrier to entry if you do that. You need to be the technical advocate for the solutions you present. And that's a big part of it too, is you have to understand how to build these tools. And you may not be the one actually building and actually maintaining, but you have to be there as a stakeholder and a planner to help them through it. Otherwise, they're just going to throw up their hands and they're going to go back to what just worked before because, hey, I know that works. Like, it may not have been ideal. And our net time from, code to deploy is 7 weeks, but at least I know how it works. And that's the worst part is when people throw up their hands and say, sorry, too hard.
I think Amazon and Microsoft are slowly shifting. Obviously, the tech giants tend to operate at a different time frame, but it sounds like DevOps is so much glue that it would be hard to put that on somebody else's plate, like near term. But when you talk about the evangelizing, I guess the culture side, of DevOps, right? So, obviously at Pinger, you came in there, you showed them full CI/CD on a small example. They're blown away. They want it. Obviously, it's going to make their life easier. What are some of the steps that you have to kind of look at, undertake to establish that right culture, the right mindset to kind of be able to head down the right path?
A lot of it is keeping the mindset that you're providing self-service, right? You're not just doing things. Like I had engineers being like, can you just build it? Like, okay, yeah, of course I could build it, but that's not going to help you, right? Like this is going to be something you own. A good example is I built the entire pipeline or the entire build system. Now, of course, I built Kubernetes and built, Cloud-based core on top of it. And I showed, started building the jobs initially, but eventually when I started migrating teams over, the way I did it is I sat with an engineer and I migrated the job over and showed them how to do it. They wrote all the Jenkins file. They wrote the code for that. And then they went through and I got another engineer to do it. And those guys got so excited, they became the, evangelists. They went back to their teams talking about how quick and easy and how fun this was. And these guys wanted to do it too. And now we're at an operating plane to where the underlying infrastructure is built, but they own their pipelines. They're the ones manipulating the Jenkins files and the build instructions. If they need a new plugin, they're able to do so, but they've got the ownership of it. So like by doing too much, you're crippling them. By doing not enough, you're preventing them, right? So it's a delicate balance that you have to hold with pushing on them the ideas of why you want to do this, which is the culture, the principle, all this, the benefits of it, and showing them the way and getting them excited about it. And then it kind of takes a life of their own. A good example is our ops team, right? Traditional ops team, data center, started building a lot of things and they never thought, they don't know branching strategies. They don't branch code. I started introducing infrastructure as code using Terraform to build out our cloud infrastructure. And then I just started everything I needed to be built. I'd make them a ticket and we'd sit down together. And fast forward nowadays, we just launched a new microservice. And I heard about it kind of towards the end when an ops engineer had fully built out the pipeline. He just done all this on his own without me. Just like he's on board, right? And other ops guys see this and that's their default now. Like once you start to get a few key players, identify the champions of what you're doing in each team, you can kind of work that because those are trusted members of the team. They've been there a long time. Either they be senior members or just, people that are looked up to, right? You find those champions and they actually help promote it for you. They promote it for their team, right? And you do this across multiple teams. And then you just start seeing overwhelming company adoption. And then all of a sudden it's got a mind of its own. Right now we're in a situation to where we've got 2 or 3 different new microservices being proposed and we're currently reviewing, and they in their system design plan, they have, fully automated CI/CD plans is just a requirement. And I'm just like, I'm so proud. Tears come to my eyes. I'm like, yes, this is so good. And it took a bit to get here and it's a lot of work, but now it's kind of got its own momentum, which is amazing. And you can't do that by pushing individual small things. You have to look at the big picture, the culture, the certain things like understanding a key towards automation, right? This is just a culture. Like the idea of saying that there's 5 manual touch points should not be a permanent state. We're actually saying, okay, now that we know that there's 5, how can we eliminate and automate that? And that should be the default everyone goes through. The idea of automated relation management, continuous delivery, integration, continuous building, and self-service. Like these are just principles that you can just keep showing and eventually they get picked up on their own. And that's a really great place to be because watching that is actually like watching your kid hit a home run. You're like, yeah, you guys got it. It's so good.
The best analogy is when somebody adopts it and makes their own, and they're often actually applying that agent of change component that you brought to them, implementing the new principles and practices. That's got to feel great because it takes a little bit of responsibility off your team, obviously, as well, because now everyone has some tools that are common across the org.
Exactly. And also, for my team, it's me and I have, a DevOps engineer, it's 2 of us, and we have 80 committers, right? So it's just not possible. It's not tenable for us to manage everyone's pipeline and like do the system design for everyone's new microservice. It's just not possible. So you wouldn't be able to do this without those champions and those people that adopt it. And they not only are able to take a lion's share of the actual work, but once it gets to them, it keeps spreading throughout their team. And one team adopts and another. And like I said, it takes on a life of its own. So it really wouldn't be possible without that adoption, without the people getting on board for you, because quite frankly, I literally just don't have enough time in the day to manage all the pipelines and to do all the stuff, right? That's not where I want to be. And teaching them how to do it and getting them excited about it is the gateway, which really provides it.
Awesome. I was just cognizant of our time, and I want to thank you for being on. I think this is really insightful. It sounds like you guys are doing some interesting things at Pinger, regardless, and obviously, you're going to see how far left you could push this to the rest of the teams. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And I'm actually speaking at DevOps World in about 2 weeks.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so I'm actually giving a talk on how we made production-like development environments, individual development environments for every engineer. So if you guys want to check it out, DevOps World 2020.
There we go. Yeah, if there's a link to that, I was going to ask you, what's the best way if somebody wants to connect with you? A Twitter, LinkedIn? Is there a preference? We'll post the links to be able to get to you.
I can give you a link to LinkedIn is actually perfect, and I'm actually putting all the details about the talk up on LinkedIn, so that's perfect.
Awesome. We'll get that into the show notes. We'll get this hopefully live before then so people can actually get to the talk. It should be a fantastic opportunity for you as well. Again, thank you for being on. That's it for this week. We'll be back with another episode next week. And as always, definitely look for ideas, concepts, talking points that you guys want to hear us address. Also, subscribe to the podcast. I think that's going to help us a lot in terms of getting the podcast growth and adoption rate out there. But until next week, thank you.